task to compare Canada to a trading partner allows you to pick a country of your choice. I thought I'd take this time to talk about some countries that Canada trades with, the developing countries that may not be as obvious, and show what the importance of those trade relationships are. So there's countries throughout the world, some are more developed than others. And Canada does trade a lot with developed countries like the United States and Europe, but it also has significant trade with developing countries. Mexico is part of the US-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. India, Brazil, China, Peru, and Saudi Arabia are other areas of focus. So you would want to understand by the end of this chapter the three classifications: the underdeveloped countries, least developed countries, sometimes called third world countries, which are at the bottom rankings of the world's economy. Developing countries, also known as emerging economies. They're transitioning from being a poorer economy to a more developed one. And developed countries, industrialized first world countries that have a high per capita income and a stable gross domestic product. So here's how they would be classified. And so you can see there's a lot of developed countries in Europe and North America. A lot of the developing countries, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are in Asia, and the underdeveloped countries are mostly in Africa, the Middle East, and South America. So why would those partners trade? While the developed countries can find new markets for their exports, they can for their services, for their technology, for some of their consumer goods. The developing countries can import goods they don't have the resources to produce themselves, and they can, maybe with their lower labor costs, they can produce things, trade them, and then use that money for community improvements to raise the level of income. We have heard negative situations like sweatshops where workers have been abused, but in many cases developing countries choose to trade because they get significant benefits. Here is a short documentary to that effect.
Matiselo Matsoso is one of 867 women who work at this apparel factory in the small, landlocked nation of Lesotho in southern Africa. Here, clothes are manufactured before being distributed and sold to consumers in the United States.
Fela ke a kgola ho no sebetsa ntate a le mong ka be ke iphumana ke tlameha hore ke tlo mo thusa hore ke tswele pele ka bophelo ba ntse bana le ho ntshakela ka nnete le hona ho ntebuisa ke fumane mosebetsi ona hobane le bona ba lakatsa ho sebetsa kwano fela o tla fumana hore ditsebo di a fapana.
There are nearly 1 billion people around the world who still live on less than $1.25 a day, and economic growth alone will not be enough to end extreme poverty by 2030. To reach this goal, countries will need to embrace policies that make it easier to trade within and across borders, creating jobs and incomes for the poor. They will also need to tackle the constraints the poor face in benefiting from trade opportunities. There are 4 leading constraints: rural poverty, gender, informality, and fragility and conflict. In rural Lao, roads are a vital lifeline for farmers trying to get their goods to markets in nearby towns.
รถโดยสารบ้านแกงเคียกับเขามาแต่กี้หันบ่มีรถบ่มีรางในบ้านนี่ได้เงินมาซื้อรถนั่นแหละรถจักรกับรถตอกรถเทปให้ลูกหลานนั่นแหละเขาขี่ไปพอไปโรงเรียนนั่นแหละในทางมามันสะดวกเดี๋ยวนี้แลนด์หั่น
Understanding the risks facing the extreme poor is key to unlocking trade's maximum potential benefit. And while the challenges are considerable, the opportunities are great. For Mataselo and others, being connected to global markets is an essential pathway out of poverty.
Ka morao re fumana mosebetsi kwane bophelo ba ka bula ba fetoga gobane ke kenya bana sekolo fela ke ne ke bona ke sokola empa ka morao ke tle kwano ke fihletse gore ke ba thusa ho ya sekolong ke ba thusa gore ke ba rekele diphalo ka khona hape le gore ke thuse batswadi ba ka ba seng ba le baholo mme wa molekane wa ka mme wa ka ya ntswalang ke khona ho ba thusa gore bophelo ba bona bo ye pele ka tšhelete ne ke fumanang kwano.
So just understand what some of the characteristics of a lower developed country would be. Due to the poverty, they're probably going to trade less. Developing countries might be able to provide technology, provide infrastructure, provide know-how about advanced manufacturing or agricultural techniques, but there can be some severe issues that are causing the economy of that country to grow at a slow rate. More developed countries trade more, and trade is exports and imports comprises a higher percentage of their GDP. So why what makes a developing country a little different from a least developed country? Well, they have better literacy rates. Usually people can attend school more instead of working, so they can attain higher levels of education and read better. The healthcare services tend to be a bit better. They're moving away from primary industries into more of a manufacturing base, and the population tends to congregate more in cities. And also, one characteristic is people are entering the middle class. The one place where the middle class is growing is in the developing countries, because as people start to get those better paying manufacturing jobs, as they start to get better educated, their earnings increase and they begin to join the middle class. So the BRICS have lots of consumer money in the middle class. So what's the benefits? Well, you could get access to investment and dollars that aren't available in your own country. Expanded choice for the consumers because there's more diverse products. It can be used to improve the environmental conditions. It is true that sometimes the mining, for example, the primary industries makes things worse off, but in many cases it can expand. It can help the community. The government can spend less money because there's more trade money coming in that can be used to upgrade the social safety net. So before 2019, some of the highest growth rates were around 6% in Africa and Asia, and you can see by their orange and red countries. That was where most of the growth rate was, and the developed countries were under 2.5, under 2%. So, but what could go wrong? Well, there's a lot of debt. Sometimes they end up taking on a loan to build the facilities, and they're unable to pay it back, and then they just get into more and more debt, paying off the interest. Their domestic businesses might not be as competitive. In Jamaica, a lot of small dairy farmers were not competitive relative to the big international companies that started to trade with them, and they just those developed countries had the economy of scale, and the local Jamaican dairy farmers could not compete. There's opportunities for corruption. There's opportunities for pollution. and it can sometimes affect the environment because of all the dependence on fossil fuel. So, finally developed countries. Now, this would include Canada, the United States, the G7, Europe. So there's a reliance on secondary and tertiary industries instead of the primary ones. There's high literacy rates, high standard of living, and there tends to be major health advancements in healthcare and technology. Now, just as a side note, this doesn't necessarily mean better healthcare. During the COVID-19 crisis, Africa had very effective public health just by doing basic door-to-door testing, something simple like that. Even though developed countries had great equipment in the hospitals, they were not able to test effectively as some of the least developed countries were. So what are some trends? Well, global sourcing means that you're going anywhere to find the best price, the best supplies, the best parts. Diversifying by finding new export partners and new products, just so that you're not relying on one country. Canada used to trade almost singularly with the United States, but now we trade with China, Europe, UK, all parts of the world. Using trade for development. Well, what does that mean? Well, one thing that Canada tries to do is link the trade with some of our policy goals, such as gender equality and maternal health. And so countries where Canada is trading, the government will help them make improvements in those areas. The theme of the International Development Week in 2020 was getting ready for 2030, helping these other countries get ready for 10 years down the road. There's some big trade organizations that all of the countries are a part of. So the World Trade Organization, 164 countries right now, 2/3 are developing country, and 34 of those are the least developed, and they actually get a few special trade regulations to help promote development. So you can see the blue is all the developing countries that are in the WTO. Now, one concern about this is that when you join the organization, you give up some rights to put trade barriers in place, and that protectionism could help domestic industries. So a bigger transnational company might be able to come into the developing country and squeeze out the local producers, and that country might not keep as much of the profits in their country that they would have if they were not in the WTO. But on the other hand, it opens up more opportunities for trade. So it's a very, very pragmatic decision that each country must make about whether or not they should join the WTO, and most countries have decided to join it. Here again, the blue countries are developing countries. There's also the International Monetary Fund, set up after World War II to sort of lend money to help rebuild Europe, and then after that to lend money to the developing world. Now this is a very controversial issue because they have lent money to developing countries, and there's 189 countries involved. So the IMF will lend money, and then they tend to the payment schedule is not entirely realistic, and the developing country cannot generate enough money to pay it back. So then they owe debt, they owe interest. So what do? They renegotiate it. And then the IMF says, okay, well, we will extend this loan, we will give you another loan, we will if you open up your market to international trade. So a local farmer, a local business might get disadvantaged by a transnational company as a result of what the IMF has done. And there is very, very strong criticism that the IMF is used by the developed countries to sort of break down the borders of the developing ones and get in there and sort of take over their economy and get money leaving the least developed countries. So some of the BRIC countries, they've funded their own development bank in Shanghai to provide finance that is not affiliated with the IMF, and that's a way that they've tried to go around the IMF, who's the world's banker, because of all the negative criticism. And it's a real issue. You need to look into the IMF and the pros and cons, because it's more than one lesson can cover. Here are some of the resources that were used to